Retirement in America once meant something very different from what it means today. In the 1950s, retirement was not surrounded by fear, constant calculation, or market anxiety. It was not about beating inflation or managing portfolios. For millions of Americans, retirement was a calm and expected stage of life. To understand why, we must first understand the America that existed after World War II. The United States emerged from the war economically powerful and socially confident. Factories that once produced tanks and weapons shifted to producing cars, appliances, and homes. Jobs were plentiful. Wages increased steadily. Unions were strong, and long-term employment was common. Most American men worked for the same company for decades. Changing jobs frequently was rare and often discouraged. Loyalty mattered, and loyalty was rewarded. Retirement, for the first time in history, became something people planned for rather than feared. By the early 1950s, the American retirement system rested on three main pillars: Social Security, employer pensions, and a low cost of living. Social Security had been created in 1935, but it truly matured after the war. By the 1950s, the program had expanded, payments had become reliable, and coverage had increased. For retirees, Social Security was not designed to provide comfort or luxury. Its purpose was simple and clear: to prevent poverty in old age. Checks arrived on time, amounts were predictable. There were no decisions to make and no risks to manage. For many retirees, Social Security covered basic living expenses such as food, utilities, and property taxes. It provided a financial floor, a guarantee that one would not fall into complete hardship. The second pillar of retirement was the employer pension. Defined benefit pension plans were widespread in the 1950s, especially in manufacturing, government jobs, railroads, and unionized industries. These pensions were simple to understand. A worker stayed with one employer for many years. At retirement, the employer promised a fixed monthly payment for life. The amount depended on years of service and final salary. Once retired, income continued until death. The retiree did not manage investments. The retiree did not watch the stock market. The retiree did not fear outliving savings. The employer carried the risk. For workers, this created an enormous sense of security. Retirement income felt almost like a continuation of employment, dependable and steady. The third pillar was the cost of living. Homes in the 1950s were affordable by today's standards. Many workers bought homes early in life and paid off their mortgages before retirement. By the time work ended, housing costs were often minimal or neg-existent. Healthcare, while limited, was far less expensive. Medical technology had not yet created long-term, high-cost treatments. There was no Medicare yet, but overall healthcare spending was low. Consumer debt was rare. Credit cards were not widespread. Families lived within their income. Together, these factors created a retirement system that felt balanced. Most retirees did not consider themselves wealthy, but they felt safe. Daily life after retirement in the 1950s was structured, modest, and calm. Many retired men continued to wake early out of habit. Mornings were quiet: newspapers, coffee, and small routines. Retirement did not mean inactivity. It meant freedom from obligation. Some retirees worked part-time jobs not because they needed money, but because work was tied to identity and purpose. Others volunteered at churches, veterans organizations, or local community groups. Gardening, home repairs, and hobbies filled the day. There was pride in staying useful. Women played a central role in retirement life. Many retired women had spent much of their lives managing households and raising families. In retirement, they continued to anchor family life. Grandchildren were often nearby. Families lived closer together. Support was informal but reliable. Entertainment was simple and shared. Evenings were spent listening to the radio or watching early television programs. Social life revolved around neighbors, churches, and community halls. There was little emphasis on consumption, no pressure to travel extensively, no expectation of luxury. Retirement was not about self-optimization, it was about stability. Perhaps the most important feature of the 1950s retirement system was where risk existed. Risk was not placed on the individual retiree. Employers bore pension risk. The government bore Social Security risk. Markets existed, but retirees were not deeply exposed to them. There were fewer choices and therefore fewer mistakes. This reduced anxiety. Retirement felt like a social contract rather than a personal gamble. But even at its strongest, the system was not perfect. It favored men with interrupted careers. Women who left the workforce often had no independent retirement income. Minority workers were frequently excluded from pension plans or offered lower benefits. Job mobility was limited. Leaving a job early could mean losing pension eligibility. The system worked best for a specific kind of worker in a specific kind of economy. And as America changed, pressure quietly began to build. By the late 1950s, the American retirement system appeared strong and dependable on the surface. But beneath that stability, quiet pressures were building. The system that worked so well in the post-war years depended on conditions that would not last forever. As the country moved into the 1960s, America itself began to change. Economic growth slowed. Global competition increased. New technologies reshaped industries, and the cost of living began to rise in ways earlier generations had never experienced. One of the first cracks appeared in the form of inflation. For retirees living on fixed incomes, inflation was invisible at first. Prices rose slowly, then steadily. Groceries cost a little more. Utilities increased. Property taxes crept upward. Defined benefit pensions paid the same amount every month, regardless of economic conditions. Social Security adjusted only gradually. What once felt sufficient slowly felt tight. Still, most retirees adjusted. They cut back modestly. They spent less. They relied on family and community. The idea of retirement remained grounded in modest expectations. But the pressure was not limited to retirees. Employers began to feel it too. Pension promises made in the 1940s and 1950s assumed long-term growth, stable workforces, and predictable lifespans. By the late 1960s, those assumptions were no longer reliable. People were living longer. Healthcare advances extended life expectancy. Pensions had to pay benefits for more years than originally planned. At the same time, companies faced rising labor costs, global competition, and changing markets. Pensions, once seen as a symbol of loyalty and strength, began to look like financial burdens. Quietly, corporate attitudes shifted. Employers began searching for ways to limit long-term obligations. Meanwhile, American society itself was transforming. More women entered the workforce. Job mobility increased. Workers no longer expected to stay with one employer for life. The retirement system of the 1950s had been designed for stability, not flexibility. It struggled to adapt. In response to rising elderly poverty and healthcare costs, the government expanded its role. In 1965, Medicare was created. For retirees, Medicare changed everything. Healthcare, once managed mostly by families, became institutionalized. Health access improved dramatically. Lifespans extended further. But longer lives also meant longer retirements and higher costs. The original financial assumptions no longer held. By the 1970s, inflation accelerated sharply. Prices rose faster than wages. Fixed pension payments lost purchasing power rapidly. Retirees felt the strain. What had once felt secure now required careful budgeting. Savings eroded. Dependence on Social Security increased. For employers, inflation turned pensions into unpredictable liabilities. The idea of guaranteeing lifetime income became increasingly unattractive. This is where the shift truly began. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, a new idea gained popularity: individual retirement accounts tied to market performance. The 401k plan was born. At first, it was seen as a supplement to pensions, but over time, it became a replacement. The responsibility for retirement moved from institutions to individuals. Workers were now expected to save, invest, and manage risk on their own. Markets mattered. Timing mattered. Financial knowledge mattered. This was a dramatic departure from the retirement philosophy of the 1950s. In the old system, mistakes were rare because choices were limited. In the new system, choices were endless and mistakes were costly. For those who had lived through the 1950s retirement era, the contrast was striking. Retirement had once been predictable. Now it was uncertain. Looking back, the 1950s system feels almost foreign today. It was built on shared responsibility. Employers accepted long-term obligations. The government provided a reliable safety net. Families and communities filled the gaps. Most importantly, the system valued security over growth. Retirees were not expected to build wealth. They were expected to maintain dignity. This mindset shaped behavior. People saved steadily, not aggressively. They avoided debt. They planned conservatively. Retirement was not a reward for financial skill. It was the result of participation in society. But the system also had blind spots. It excluded many Americans. Minority workers were often denied access to pensions. Women depended heavily on spousal benefits. Job mobility was punished rather than supported. As America diversified and modernized, these flaws became harder to ignore. The collapse of the old system was not sudden. It happened quietly over decades. One pension frozen here, another converted there. A new plan offered to new hires only. By the time many workers noticed, the old guarantees were already gone. Today, retirement feels personal again, just as it did before Social Security existed. But unlike the early 1900s, modern retirement is deeply tied to financial markets. Security depends on returns, timing, and discipline. For many older Americans watching this transformation, the memory of the 1950s remains powerful. It represents a time when retirement felt human. Not easy, but understandable. At Financial Notes, we study financial history not to romanticize the past, but to learn from it. The retirement system of the 1950s reminds us that economic systems reflect values. When society valued stability, retirement reflected stability. When society shifted towards flexibility and efficiency, retirement shifted too. The question is not whether the old system should return exactly as it was. The question is what we choose to value going forward: security or growth, shared responsibility or individual risk, simplicity or complexity. History does not provide easy answers, but it provides perspective. And perspective matters, especially in retirement. Thank you for listening. This is Financial Notes, where financial history helps us understand the present.